Good day, people. This is a discussion about Eric Fromm's classic work, The Sane Society. And Eric Fromm was a psychologist. He was a German Jew who survived the Nazi concentration camps. And I think in one way or another, his writings really harken back to that experience. He's part of the Frankfurt School. He's a student of Freud. And I'm just going to jump into it. And the gist of the book really is our technology making us crazy? So Karam says this. He says, could it be the middle class life of prosperity, while satisfying our material needs, leaves us with a feeling of intense boredom, and that suicide and alcoholism are pathological ways of escape from this boredom? And then he says, to speak of a sane society implies a premise different from sociological relativism. It makes sense only if we assume that there can be a society which is not sane, right? Sanity really means health, mental health. Insanity means, for better or worse, terms like madness, craziness. The word sane comes from the Latin sanus, which means health. So anything that is insane is unhealthy for the body. And especially the mind. So Fromm says to speak of a sane society implies a premise different from sociological relativism. It makes sense only if we assume that there can be a society which is not sane. And this assumption in turn implies that there are universal criteria for mental health which are valid for the human race as such, and according to which the state of health of each society can be judged. This position of normative humanism is based on a few fundamental premises, and he'll explain the premises throughout. Okay, here Fromm is talking about inauthenticity, and we have to reflect to what extent is this created and exacerbated by our mass media pop culture. So Fromm says this. He says, today we come across a person who acts and feels like an automaton, right? Like a robot, who never experiences anything which is really his, who experiences himself entirely as the person he thinks he is supposed to be, whose artificial smile has replaced genuine laughter, whose meaningless chatter has replaced communicative speech, whose dull despair has taken the place of genuine pain. And so what Fromm is doing is creating this notion of inauthenticity, right? That this person who is kind of fake and phony and doesn't really have a sense of identity, or who borrows it from various sort of mediated communicative phenomena. Fromm continues, he says, the necessity to find ever new solutions for the contradictions in his existence, to find ever higher forms of unity with nature, his fellow men, and himself is the source of all psychic forces which motivate man, of all his passions, affects, and anxieties. Eric Fromm wrote the best-selling work, The Art of Loving, which is pretty much the textbook on the concept of love for the 20th century. You really should check it out. It's a master work. And so he has this to say about the idea of love as a kind of antidote for this technological automatism and alienation, right? The stuff that's making us crazy. He says this. He says, love is a union with somebody or something outside oneself under the condition of retaining the separateness and integrity of one's own self. And then here he talks about the productive orientation. He says, love is one aspect of what I have called the productive orientation, the active and creative relatedness of man to his fellow man, to himself, and to nature. Then he says this, he breaks this notion of the productive orientation down into these three categories of thought, action, and feeling. And I find this so useful. He says, in the realm of thought, this productive orientation is expressed in the proper grasp of the world by reason. And it's only through reason. What's the opposite of reason? The opposite of reason is superstition, anything goes, BS, conspiracy theories, and no, like you could look at the world prior to the Enlightenment. And you see, the opposite of reason is existing in a kind of dark ages. Fromm continues, he says, in the realm of action, the productive orientation is expressed in productive work, the prototype, which is art and craftsmanship. And so this idea of, how are you going to earn your daily bread? How are you going to alter and augment the world? And there are some of us who earn our living through a kind of artistic craftsmanship. Our goal is to create something significant and beautiful and long lasting, as perhaps opposed to a very um, repetitive kind of labor. I mean, at the extreme opposite end would be slave sweatshop like labor, where it would be doing the same thing over and over again, deriving no real substantive benefit from the labor. It's really just stealing away our time and our existence. Fromm continues, he says, in the realm of feeling, the productive orientation is expressed in love, which is the experience of union with another person, with all men and with nature, under the condition of retaining one's sense of integrity and independence. And I mean, indeed, love is a sort of schmaltzy abstract concept in a way. We overutilize the word, but in its authentic philosophical and theoretical sense and how it functions in terms of the heroic and everyday relationships, love between mother and child, love between friends, right? Love for one's country and one's culture and nature, as he puts it. Um, it's really this amazing phenomenon. So Fromm has this four-tiered definition of love. It kind of has these four parts: caring, responsibility, respect, and knowledge. And he says this, he says, if I love, I care. That is, I'm actively concerned with the other person's growth and happiness. I'm not a spectator. I'm responsible. That is, I respond to his needs, to those he can express, and more so to those he cannot or does not express. I respect him. That is, according to the original meaning of res specira, I look at him as he is, objectively and not distorted by my wishes and fears. I know him. I have penetrated through his surface to the core of his being and relate myself to him from my core, from the center as against the periphery of my being. And so again, I mean, the reason that we're talking about this is because of his book, The Sane Society. And so he's making this argument that love, in a way, is the response to technological automatism and alienation, and that this kind of technological roboticism is making us crazy. Continuing this notion of labor and the kind of human relation to labor and kind of what that does for our identity and our psychology. Fromm says this, he says, in the act of creation, man transcends himself as a creature, raises himself beyond the passivity and accidentalness of his existence into the realm of purposefulness and freedom. So here, Eric Fromm talks about kind of the positive and negative aspects of gender roles. And I'm just going to get to it. I don't want to make too big a deal about it, but it is interesting. So, Fromm says, Bachoven, who was a mythological scholar, saw clearly both the negative and the positive aspects of the attachment to the mother figure. The positive aspect is a sense of affirmation of life, freedom, and equality which pervades the matriarchal structure. The negative aspect of the matriarchal structure was also clearly seen by Bachoven. Being bound to nature, to blood and soil, man is blocked from developing his individuality and his reason. To sum up, the positive aspects of the patriarchal complex are reason, discipline, conscience, and individualism. The negative aspects are hierarchy, oppression, equality, and submission. And so here we have this interesting duality, this tension or opposition between the genders. So the positive aspects of the male are different from the positive aspects of the female. And any culture is going to have a kind of a unique or interesting blend of the two. Fromm says, in building the new industrial machine, man became so absorbed in the new task that it became the paramount goal of his life. His energies, which once were devoted to the search for God and salvation, were now directed toward the domination of nature and ever increasing material comfort. He ceased to use production as a means for a better life, but hypostatized, he represented as real, it instead to an end in itself, an end to which life was subordinated. In the process of an ever increasing division of labor, ever increasing mechanization of work, and an ever increasing size of social agglomerations or kind of combinations and how the giant megacities, man himself became a part of the machine rather than its master. And so here he's kind of talking about what leads us to this insanity, and he's kind of beckoning or he's calling for a more saner approach to culture. Fromm continues, right? Here's the payoff. He says he experienced himself as a commodity, as an investment. His aim became to be a success, that is, to sell himself as profitably as possible on the market. And so here he's talking about the kind of inauthentic, cynical, salesman-like, we become something that we're not. He continues, his value as a person lies in his saleability, not in his human qualities of love, reason, or his artistic capacities. Happiness becomes identical with consumption of newer and better commodities, the drinking in of music, screenplays, fun, sex, liquor, and cigarettes. Not having a sense of self, except the one which conformity with the majority can give. He is insecure, anxious, depending on approval. He is alienated from himself, worships the products of his own hands, the leaders of his own making, as if they were above him, rather than made by him. He is, in a sense, back where he was before the great human evolution began in the second millennium BC, which is to say, he's a slave of his idols, his technological gadgetries, and his comforts, which modern man worships. You know, that is Eric Fromm's critique of modern insanity. Fromm continues, he says, this alienation and automatization leads to an ever increasing insanity. Life is not meaning, there is no joy, no faith, no reality. Everybody is happy except that he does not feel, does not reason, does not love. And then he concludes, he says, in the 19th century, the problem was that God is dead, right? That was Nietzsche, God is dead. In the 20th century, the problem is that man is dead, right? So it's like, is it better or is it worse in the 21st century, right? In the 19th century, inhumanity meant cruelty. In the 20th century, it means schizoid self-alienation. I mean, are we saner or crazier than our counterparts in previous times? The danger of the past was that men became slaves. The danger of the future is that men may become robots. And so here's this sort of the technological alienation of the self, sort of losing its capacities for emotion and love and care and an adequate relation to one's self, environment, and labor and fellow human beings.